the structure of this event departs a bit from what was originally advertised. And I think this will make it better than it otherwise would have been. It will consist and start with a lecture by Professor Bruce Gilley of Portland State University, who I will introduce a little more thoroughly in a moment, who will make the case for colonialism as a historical phenomenon being, on the whole, a constructive event. And colonialism he's thinking here during the 19th and 20th centuries. I'll leave the complications of the thesis to Professor Gilley to expound. That will be followed by a rebuttal from a member of our own faculty, Dr. Paul Bjerk, who is the History Department's historian of Africa. The two professors will then engage in some back and forth, which is why we have those chairs up here in front of the room, after which questions will be taken from the floor. To accommodate all of this, we will extend the length of this event from an hour and a half to 2, if that proves to be necessary. Some of you, as I said, may be shocked that the overall impact of colonialism can be open to question at all, but it's rare that any complex phenomenon like colonialism, or democracy, or freedom, or nationalism, or capitalism, or socialism is either simply good or bad. Moreover, the evaluation of such phenomena change with the times. They change historically, seen one way in one era and very differently in another. It is and should be the university's role to help promote this ongoing process of evaluation and reevaluation. So, that said, let me introduce our participants to what is more than just a lecture, but I hope a model intellectual act. And I will introduce them both now and then invite them consecutively, one after the other, to come up on the stage and to deliver their comments. So the lecturer is Dr. Bruce Gilley. He is a professor in the political science department at Portland State University in Oregon. He has written 5 books, some of which certainly, of their nature, third world politics, touch upon or require an understanding of colonialism and its impact. They are, among other things, I'll give you all 5 of them: The Nature of Asian Politics, Cambridge University Press, 2014; The Right to Rule, How States Win and Lose Legitimacy, Columbia University Press, 2009; China's Democratic Future, How It Will Happen and Where It Will Lead, it's an optimistic book, Columbia University, 2004; Model Rebels, The Rise and Fall of China's Richest Village, University of California Press, 2001; and Tiger on the Brink, Jiang Zemin and China's New Elite, also University of California, 1998, and a variety of other books, 27 peer-reviewed articles, some of which are on colonialism. The one that sort of the occasion for this talk, my inviting him, was an article that has the same title as the lecture, which was 2 years ago, I believe, 1 year ago, accepted by a well-known peer-reviewed journal in the field called Third World Studies, and then had to be withdrawn because the editor of the journal, who was based in London, was receiving death threats that the Metropolitan Police of London told him were serious. And he asked Professor Gilley if, for the sake of his safety, the article could be withdrawn, and Professor Gilley consented. So, fraught subject, obviously. Responding to Professor Gilley, and I'm very appreciative that he's doing it. He's doing it at my request at the last moment, is Professor Paul Bjerk. I always try to get that right. I don't know how close I came there. Who's Associate Professor and Director of Graduate Studies in the History Department, as I said. He is our Africanist among the historians. And he is the author of 2 books. His focus has been on Tanzania, and he is the author of a biography of the founding father of Tanzania, Julius Nyerere, and another book called Building a Peaceful Nation, Julius Nyerere and the Establishment of Sovereignty in Tanzania, 1960 to 1964. So, thank you all for being here, and let us begin with Professor Gilley.
This is the first time I've given a public talk on this topic, more than a year since a global lynch mob tried to stop me from publishing my peer-reviewed article, The Case for Colonialism. The University of Oxford, whose chancellor was the last colonial governor of Hong Kong, had to keep my talk there in May secret because he could not trust his own faculty to behave like adults. So, students of Texas Tech, you should be proud to be the first to have a public lecture where this can be done. My article of September 2017, The Case for Colonialism, was published in the Third World Quarterly, as Dr. Balch mentioned. The purpose of the article was to outline what I and many colleagues in the harder social sciences believe is the clear evidence for the benefits and legitimacy of the second phase of European imperialism, which ran roughly from the mid-1800s to the mid-1900s. I also spent about half of the paper discussing how those valuable lessons could be recovered by today's weak and failed states. As a professor at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government told me after the storm about the paper, that the paper I wrote has been, quote, brewing for some time, unquote, and someone was bound to write it. But for the 16,000 people around the world who signed petitions demanding the retraction of the article, any evidence or discussion of the evidence needed to be suppressed, not debated. A week after the article's appearance, as has been mentioned, the editorial team asked for my permission to withdraw it because credible death threats, and I obviously assented. The article has now been republished in the National Association of Scholars House Journal Academic Questions in this past April. One of the fairest criticisms of the paper was that I did not provide enough evidence or documentation for the central claims about the objective benefits and subjective legitimacy of colonialism, although that section of the paper absorbed only 1,500 of the 7,000 words. To that end, I have since provided what is in effect the missing bibliography of the paper, entitled Contributions of Western Colonialism to Human Flourishing, a Summary of Research, now available in its version 1.0 on my website and on the research site ResearchGate. I could easily spend this entire talk going through the rigorous social scientific research that I gathered there, which in my mind shows what should be in any case a statement of the obvious. When a more advanced society is given the opportunity to diffuse its economic, technological, administrative, and educational systems to a less advanced society that by and large welcomes its presence, the results are so obviously good compared to what would otherwise have happened in that society that the only interesting questions are how large the positive effects are. I would highlight from that bibliography recent work by Fayer and Sacerdote, as well as Easterly and Levine on economic development, by Shurkins on labor mobility and wage growth, by Donaldson on railroads, by Samadar on the rule of law, by Brahms as well as Figer and Asifu Adeghi on public finances, by Shaw as well as Sartori on human rights, by Hariri on modern state building, by Olson as well as Woodbury on democracy, by Basu on education, by Massani on cultural preservation and articulation, by Grindal on the abolition of slavery, by Selhausen on female emancipation, by Calvi and Mantovelli on public health, by Boomgaard on food supply and population growth, and by Etemad on the vanishingly small numbers of Europeans who ran colonial administrations, which speaks to the question of legitimacy. From this research, we know that in terms of body count, nothing comes close to anti-colonialism in terms of having cost lives and prevented lives. You simply have to do the math and compare trajectories in the late colonial period of the 1920s onward, when populations were growing, food supply expanding, life expectancy leaping upwards, government administration improving, wages and living standards bowling forward, and plans for self-government unfolding, and compare the widening gap of those trends with where most, but not all, former colonies ended by, say, the late 1980s. But I fear that such a talk would not change many minds, because as I have come to realize, this is not really a scientific debate, Most anti-colonial critics will roll their eyes when you try to engage them in questions of social scientific research, because the real motivation is not getting history right, but getting the present right. Either they reject research findings as yet more evidence of Western imperialism and the need to, quote-unquote, decolonize research, or they fear that formerly colonized peoples have such fragile psyches that they could not withstand an encounter with facts that make them uncomfortable. You may have heard of the case of Helen Zille, a former premier of the Western Cape province of South Africa, who in June this year was found guilty by the country's ethics board of improper conduct for tweeting after a visit to Singapore that South Africa should similarly build upon the valuable inheritance of British colonialism rather than trash it. South Africa provides a powerful image of this problem. Its 25-year slow-motion collapse since the end of apartheid is closely linked to its inability to embrace its British colonial past. In 1993, the average Singaporean was 4.5 times wealthier than the average South African. Today, they are 7 times wealthier. In 1993, it took 1 Singapore dollar and 1.8 South African rand to buy a US dollar. Today, it takes 84 Singapore cents to buy a US dollar, but 6.2 South African rand, using purchasing power equivalents. Such declines in living standards might not make great photos or great Wikipedia articles, but they cost far more lives. The ethics board that censured Zille cited the mob attack on my article as evidence that the voicing of pro-colonial viewpoints should be curtailed. In her defense, Zille quoted no less an authority than Nelson Mandela, citing the benefits of British colonialism in South Africa. Clearly, these are lessons that the lawless and ignorant public prosecutor who found Zille guilty does not want to learn, nor do most anti-colonial critics. There's a second reason why I do not think it would be productive to go through the social scientific research on colonialism. We today live in a post-truth era in which social media and Google are more authoritative sources of information than robust research. It took Donald Davidson, an economist at MIT, 10 years to research and publish his new article in the American Economic Review, Railways of the Raj, that shows unambiguously the positive impact of railroad development in colonial India. It takes a critic only 1 second to Google and find the Congress politician Shashi Tharoor declaring in the Guardian newspaper that the railroads were, quote unquote, a colonial scam that harmed Indians. So I'm going to use this talk to engage in a more rhetorical and topical presentation that I think at the very least will lay out the arguments for colonialism. In 1887, a woman belonging to the Muslim Hausa ethnic group was born in the slave-based Sokoto Caliphate of what is today northern Nigeria. The Caliphate was the creation of the Fulani ethnic group, which had defeated and subjugated rival tribes in a series of wars between 1804 and 1808, including the Habe branch of the Hausa, to which this woman belonged. Fulani rule decayed with each successive ruler, so that by 1886, when the British government gave a monopoly for trading in the region to the Royal Niger Company, the subject peoples of this empire were ready for a change. The Royal Niger Company found ready partners willing to sign treaties in exchange for liberation from Fulani autocracy. In 1899, the British government assumed control of the region from the Royal Niger Company, and in 1900, its troops, mostly black natives, arrived in this woman's village named Karo to assert their control. Quote, "We Habe wanted them to come. It was the Fulani who did not like it," unquote. The woman, known as Baba, recalled. Why, you might ask, would an African woman welcome European colonization? Baba explained, quote, "When the Europeans came, the Habe saw that if you worked for them, they paid you for it. They didn't say, like the Fulani, 'Commoner, give me this. Commoner, bring me that.' Yes, the Habe wanted them. They saw no harm in them," unquote. Was this just an initial response that Baba of Cairo later regretted? No, far from it. As she explained, life got immeasurably better after British colonization. The best thing the Europeans did was free slaves and depose indigenous tyrants. Quote, "The Europeans don't like oppression, but they found a lot of tyranny and oppression here, people being beaten and killed and sold into slavery," unquote. For her personally, another benefit was the improved status of women. Quote, "In the old days, if the chief liked the look of your daughter, he would take her and put her in his house. You could do nothing about it. Now they don't do that," unquote. Baba of Cairo told her story over a 6-week period in December 1949 and January 1950 to the English anthropologist Marie Felice Smith. The testimony was published as Baba of Cairo, a Woman of the Muslim Hausa in 1954. Your library holds the book. And you can listen to an online interview that the BBC did earlier this year with Marie Felice Smith, now in her 90s. What are we to make of this first-hand account of an African woman's experience of the coming of colonialism? It is strange that Baba welcomes the coming of the British, wrote a scholar from Niger in a 1994 essay. Yet a moment's reflection, he wrote, shows why it made sense. Baba of Cairo faced a concrete choice as a young girl between the relatively benign rule of the British and the fearsome rule of Fulani tyrants and the slave and wife raiders they protected. So, the scholar from Niger wrote, it was not the British but the slave raiders and the Fulani who were the, quote, nasty other. In fact, the British never became the nasty other for Baba of Cairo. She was perfectly content in her cultural space, and the British protected and enlarged that cultural space by removing the threats to it from slave raiders and Fulani tyrants. The peace and security of British rule were the main changes that colonialism brought. Life went on more or less as usual in other respects, which is why no one thought of resisting the British, and why most of Baba of Cairo's book is about social relationships during her time. There was no tension in Baba's worldview between being pro-colonial and pro-Habe. Quite the opposite. The British facilitated the articulation of an authentic, living, and surviving Habe culture. Why do I dwell at such length on the story of Baba of Cairo? Because it is such a profound rebuke to the contemporary anti-colonial writers who presume to make the choices that women like Baba faced over a century ago. Among the widely circulated critiques of my paper, one was written by an American journalist who found some gruesome photos from King Leopold's Congo on the internet and then ramped up his outrage with claims that my paper amounted to Holocaust denial. If you will indulge me, let us imagine a conversation between Baba of Cairo and a composite of the various writers who have attacked my paper, whom I will call Edward of Boston. Edward. Baba, how could you endorse a system that dismantled your governing institutions and replaced them with unaccountable alien rule? Baba, actually, Edward, our governing institutions even before the Fulani Empire were more autocratic than anything the British imposed. In any case, like most colonized peoples, we lived under alien rule already when the Europeans arrived. Either a rival ethnic group or a rival subgroup or faction were always in charge. Circa 1900, rule by the British, the most accountable political system in the world at the time, versus the caliphs of Sokoto, hell yeah. Edward. But once you accepted British rule, self-government became impossible, whereas you could have slowly democratized the Sokoto Caliphate. Baba, eyes as big as saucers. The British began talking about preparing their colonies for self-government in the 1850s. The Caliphate believed only in the rule of Islam. Colonialism was the pathway to self-government. Isn't that what happened in Boston too, Edward? What about the atrocities committed by colonial rulers throughout the 19th and 20th centuries? Amritsar, Namibia, Mau Mau, and in your country of Nigeria, there were those 57 women traders shot dead by colonial police in 1929 over taxes. There are a lot of pictures and Wikipedia articles on the internet. I see how enlivened you are talking about atrocities, Edward. Why do you know so little about the atrocities in world history that did not involve Europeans? One reason is that they were not recorded. You'll find no pictures of them on the internet, Edward, and no Wikipedia articles. We know about the frontier wars in British settlement colonies because they were recorded, investigated, debated, and yes, the atrocities were punished by the British. You like the picture of severed hands in the Congo under King Leopold II, Edward. Have you seen the pictures of the piles of bodies in the eastern Congo under Al-Zubir, or the torched villages left in the Congo by Tipo Tip? They were the most fearsome of the many Sudanese, Nubianese, and Egyptian slave traders and ivory tyrants who terrorized the Congo area before the relatively benign rule of King Leopold II. Would it surprise you to learn, Edward, that most people welcomed King Leopold's rule? Indeed, that is what explains how Tipo Tip, who began as governor of the king's eastern holdings, lost control. Why are there only 4 books on Tipo Tip, but at last count hundreds on King Leopold II's Congo Free State? Do you care about actual history of peoples like my own, Edward? And by the way, King Leopold's Congo Free State was not a Belgian colony. it was a private fiefdom whose abuses were precisely the argument in favor of Belgian colonization in 1908. How could you get such a basic fact wrong, Edward? Yes, perhaps you should be forgiven. Because the American journalist Adam Hochschild subtitled his 1998 book, King Leopold's Ghost, quote, "A story of greed, terror, and heroism in colonial Africa," unquote. I guess American journalists are just sloppy with facts. Although Hochschild notes in his book that the Free State, quote, "was shared in no way with the Belgian government," unquote. But Baba, you keep changing the subject. My subject is colonial atrocities. My subject is saving human lives. Even when native atrocities were recorded somehow, like the Nama massacre of a fifth of the Herero population in today's Namibia, in a single day in 1850, at a place now known as Murder Hill, where women's feet were chopped off to obtain the copper rings they wore around their legs, you don't seem interested, Edward. Didn't you read what I told Marie Felice Smith about the constant warfare and murder my people faced under the Fulani? We did not have cameras, like the Belgian lawyers investigating the atrocities of King Leopold's private fiefdom. In any case, I guess you would roll your eyes in boredom. And by the way, the suppression of the Mao in Kenya and the women's war in Nigeria were both justified. The use of force was proportional to the threat. That's why most Kenyans and most Nigerians supported the colonial governments. Indeed, they did most of the restoration of order and the prison work. Amritsar and Namibia, on the other hand, were crimes, to be sure, and they were immediately recognized as such by the colonial governments, and those responsible punished. In any case, sorry to come back to counterfactuals, Edward, but the Herero and Nama in Namibia, for example, were longtime rivals who were stockpiling arms for a war each other at the time of German settlement. Do you think they would have resolved their differences with a roundtable conference? Yes, I am lucky. I was not a victim of a colonial atrocity or a colonial settlement war. I was, however, the victim of a Fulani atrocity, after slave raiders carried off members of my family. Please read my book, Edward. Even the libraries in Boston have copies. Even so, Baba, you seem to be engaging in a sort of morally cold-hearted cost-benefit analysis, that the good things that came with colonialism can offset the bad things. I'm still not sure what the bad things are in my case, Edward, but to give you the benefit of the doubt, let's throw some possible things out there. The humiliation and psychological harms of alien rule, the short-circuiting of our indigenous development path, the empowerment of chiefs with the backing of colonial coercion. Yes, perhaps these were harms in some cases. And when harms cross some threshold, they can never be justified by goods. But none of these, even if true, which I doubt, came close to that in my case. Are you saying, Edward, that the survival and longer lives that my Habe people enjoyed after the British should be weighed against unaccountable chiefs or psychological harms that seem to be mainly a concern of French-educated intellectuals? Maybe you just have false consciousness, Baba. You believed the British were legitimate rulers, rulers who had more of a right to rule your people than the feasible alternatives, because you really had no choice. You had a gun to your head, and you rationalized your behavior. Didn't your professors ever teach you how demeaning it is to dismiss viewpoints with which you disagree, especially among the common people, as false consciousness? Maybe the silly little people like me could not think for ourselves, as you imply, Edward. A whole generation of Western academics has dismissed voices like mine as false consciousness. But it was the elites who chose to invite and ally with the British in northern Nigeria. They had a choice to fight, but chose cooperation. The man who would become the premier of northern Nigeria at independence, also from a small tribe like mine, wrote this of the coming of the British, quote, "There was no ill will after the occupation. We were used to conquerors, and these were different. They were polite and obviously out to help us rather than themselves," unquote. Okay, but really, colonialism goes way farther back, to the 16th through the 18th centuries, when the British were major slavers, and their American, Canadian, Australian, and New Zealand settlers were massacring all and sundry. Shouldn't we throw that into the equation too? Should we? And call them morally reprehensible for doing what every non-Western culture, including my own, was also doing at the same time, simply without the technological and economic capacity of the West to make it work? These were frontier battles. Every empire, Ottoman, Qing, Russian, Japanese, was expanding its frontiers through warfare at that time. That's what empires did. The Zulus in southern Africa, the Maori in the South Pacific, the Bantu and Buganda in East Africa. I mean, do you know how they came to occupy their ancestral homelands, Edward? And not only in ancient times. The Maori of New Zealand massacred most of the 1,600 Moriori people on the Chatham Islands in a single day in 1835, and then claimed the islands as their ancestral homeland. And where did the ideas for changes to those expansionist norms come from? Actually from Europe. The Dutch lawyers who developed ideas of international law, the Quakers who led the push against slavery, the Scottish and English liberals who developed ideas of land rights. So you are appealing to norm shifts that came from the European colonizers themselves. It matters. It's not the same thing as burning down a fellow's house and then offering to rebuild it. A better analogy is the slumlord, who has a moral awakening and decides she is going to live better. She chooses to set higher standards for her rental units, fixing broken pipes, keeping the heaters on. She advocates among her fellow slumlords to make this a norm. Eventually, they make it a law. Are you telling me, Edward, that she has no business claiming to have done good because she used to be a slumlord? Okay, but in the end, they stole your money. They took your commodities. They locked you into economic dependency. They paid us, as I told Marie Felice Smith. My family's children had job opportunities we could never dream of. And by the way, you Marxists have a strange way of understanding economics. Commodities cannot simply be pulled from the earth and deposited in a bank. If they could, resource-rich countries like mine would be rich instead of poor. Why? Because wealth comes from an economic system. It comes from free markets, the rule of law, global trade, corporate organization, social trust, investment certainty, worker training and education and infrastructure. Do you think this stuff just happens, Edward? Do you have any idea why Boston is so prosperous? Because of the large number of clams in Boston Harbor? Well, Bubba, you're really flogging a dead horse here. I mean, nothing will ever convince most people that colonialism was a good thing. Perhaps, Edward? But truth matters to me, and it should matter to you too. And it also matters because it has lessons for today. Have you heard of Chinua Achebe, the great Nigerian novelist? In his last book, he reminded his readers that Nigeria benefited a lot from British colonialism and urged them to reclaim some of that past, like excellent administration and meritocracy in government and business. I'm sorry, Baba, I can't debate this any longer. I'm late for a mental decolonization rally at the Graduate Student Union. Your mind has been colonized by a half a century of gibberish about the evils of Western colonialism, Edward. A little decolonization of that material would be good for you. Frowns, smiles. Over the past year, I've had many debates of that sort. Critics have now retreated to calls for censorship with the claim that while they believe in free speech and academic freedom, they draw the line when it comes to research on colonialism that they believe is factually inaccurate or which is violent and oppressive. The new terms they have invented are academic integrity and academic monitoring, so that scholars with inappropriate ideological orientations, such as me, are put under the charge of scholars with advanced ideological views, who seem mostly to be found in English departments. As a scholar of China, my teaching of Mao's Cultural Revolution will never be the same. One obvious response to such charges is, to borrow John Stuart Mill's defense of liberty, that you will never really know whose arguments are factually correct and normatively defensible unless they are exposed to the strong gale of counter-argument. I am glad that Dr. Bjerk accepted Dr. Balch's invitation to rebut my arguments for that reason. The more substantive response would be this. If factual or social scientific validity and normative defensibility are the standards by which we should judge scholarship on colonialism, then I submit that the problems of inaccuracy, misrepresentation, and ethical sophistry giving rise to scholarship that perpetuates violence and oppression against formerly colonized people lie in the main with the anti-colonial scholars who dominate the contemporary academy. Over this time, I have received letters and testimonies from dozens of people in the former colonial areas, writing in support of me and thanking me for giving voice to voices which have been silenced for half a century. One was written by a Nigerian woman, now my Facebook friend, who is an educational consultant in that country. She called the mob attacks on my article in an essay she wrote for an African online publication, Comitas US, quote, a bilious personification of anti-intellectualism, unquote. Many Nigerians, she wrote, quote, see the colonial era as something of a golden age, unquote. The most lasting legacy, in her view, was education, which is the focus of her research. Quote, will I ever be able to publish my research? This is the fearful state that outraged mobs have put myself and others in. But I won't be intimidated. I will say what I believe to be true, no matter what, unquote. She's a brave Nigerian woman and is trying to help her country by recovering lessons from British colonial institutions that young people may use in their educations. Recently, just a week ago, I received an email from a young Indian scholar studying for a graduate degree in Shakespeare here in Texas. He wrote, my great-grandfather, born to field laborers in southern India, was educated by Christian missionaries, Britishers, the very colonizers I am supposed to hate. He was, having been so educated, commissioned by the British government to found and run a high school in the village of his birth. His son, my grandfather, was the first of that village to complete high school, as well as to complete university. Moreover, he was employed by the British government as a statistician, which was very prestigious in those days. My grandmother, similarly educated, was able to go as far as a master's degree because of the educational system set up by the British. It is because of colonialism that my family was educated, elevated far beyond the station of their birth, and it is because of this colonialism that I am able to study Shakespeare at an American university rather than labor in a field in India. Both of these authentic voices from people in former colonized areas, and many more have written, and you can find their essays on my website, are being told by progressives, mostly in the West, that they need to shut up. I stand with them. Still, to Edward's point about flogging a dead horse, why should we really care? Many of my colleagues will say privately that they agree with me, but why enter into this fraught debate and risk being called a white supremacist or a Holocaust denier? It's not worth it. And frankly, I'm starting to agree with them. To some extent, I think pragmatism is the best way forward. It's complex, it brings out bitter memories. The question is, where do we go from here? I think there are both intellectual and institutional prescriptions, but I put the most store by the former, and indeed most of my paper has to do with how to recover the lessons and institutions of colonialism as one of the fixes for today's weak and failing states. In an essay for the Indian magazine Open that I published in October, I wrote about the profound psychological disconnect that continues to afflict many third world countries in their relations with the West. I was writing about the Nobel laureate V.S. Naipaul, who died in September, one of the great intellectuals to emerge from the third world. A native of Trinidad whose ancestors had migrated to the British colony from India, Naipaul was profoundly aware of the great what-might-have-beens of his life. He called the West the leader of a, quote, universal civilization, unquote, that was alone freely accessible to all and sundry, including himself. Colonialism had given countries and peoples like him access to this universal civilization. It was regenerative and beneficial because it allowed the world's diverse civilizations and cultures to flourish. Those who tore it down were like children pounding on the chests of their parents. And I give an extended treatment of the case of Guinea-Bissau in the original essay, where that tearing down and that destruction was epic. I began this whole research project with another article in the scholarly journal African Affairs, writing about Chinua Achebe, the Nigerian novelist, who is largely misrepresented as being anti-colonial. He's not. He urged an intellectual reformation on his countrymates that has yet to take place. China's economic boom is a result of an intellectual coming to terms with colonialism. It's largely prompted by the example of Hong Kong that was on its border. That British colony, according to Paul Romer, the former chief economist of the World Bank, did more to reduce poverty in the third world than a half a century of Western aid, because it created a model for China that China could emulate and use. Success requires coming to terms intellectually with the positive legacies of colonialism, as China did, and as Helen Zille has urged upon her countrymen in South Africa. But this intellectual turn requires a massive enlightenment, and I don't see signs of it yet. No less an otherwise reliable newspaper than the Wall Street Journal recently carried an article an approving article on the decolonization of Belgium's Royal Museum for Central Africa. According to the article, the, quote, woefully dated statuary, unquote, and the, quote, exoticism, unquote, of the museum is being airbrushed in a makeover in which colonial-era imagery will be countered with the new images showing, quote, unquote, colonial-era oppression, and asserting, in the title of one statue, a burgeoning Congo of today, including a robot used to control traffic in Kinshasa. Colonial apologists, quote unquote, will be sent packing by the new museum, and instead Belgian visitors will be abjectly told of the cruelty of their ancestors, and by ascription themselves, and how, but for their meddling in Central Africa, there would have been a land of milk and honey. The fact is that the Congo under Al-Zubir and Tipo-Tip was doing anything but burgeon. And after the Belgians colonized the country in 1908, it entered into its only era of burgeoning, which lasted until so-called independence in 1960, under pressure from those who the great chief of Luanda, of the Congo Center, called, quote-unquote, loudmouthed minorities. This, by the way, according to the Contemporary Academy, makes the great chief of Luanda a white supremacist, a charge that I presume the old chief would have considered evidence of the inscrutable ways of the West. And those robot-controlled intersections in Kinshasa, it's a story that the Western liberal media loves, and it repeats old tropes about an African Renaissance. But it is more evidence of Africa imploding. They are designed to prevent bribery caused by mistrust between police and people. The robots cost $27,000 each and are paid for by foreign aid. They sidestep the issue of administrative capacity and state-society trust. A writer for The Atlantic calls them, quote, a public relations stunt that turns attention away from serious growth and infrastructure issues, unquote. They appeared after municipal elections were canceled, quote, the flashy modern way to distract the public from scrutinizing bad governance, unquote. So, the decolonization of the Royal Museum for Central Africa perfectly embodies the fatuous nature of anti-colonialism. A Belgian colonial state that made lives better for ordinary Congolese is being scrubbed from history and replaced by a RoboCop that symbolizes the tyranny and dysfunction of contemporary Congo. The institutional fixes are more straightforward. Show a picture. Look at this picture. I chose it because it's relatively benign. It's a picture on the right of a boy found by a Danish aid worker in Nigeria in 2016 who had been left to starve to death by the local community because they believed he was a witch. UNICEF estimates that in this one southwestern state of Nigeria where he was found, there are 15,000 children similarly abandoned by their parents as witches, and nationwide 10,000 a year added to the rolls. I pair the photo with one from the Biafra War on the left that erupted in Nigeria after independence and cost between 1 and 3 million lives. The Danish aid worker who found this boy got together with her local Nigerian colleagues and established the Land of Hope Children's Center in Nigeria for rescued children, most of whom are considered to be witches. The Nigerian government is unable and unwilling to act against this cultural practice. ExxonMobil has funded the center, along with a lot of international donors. The center is essentially playing the colonial role of filling in a governance deficit. Here's a happier picture. Here's some of the boys of the Land of Hope Center on the left, a picture of the staff on the bottom, and the young boy who was rescued from the street on the right, now thriving with hearing aids because he had lost his hearing as a result of malnutrition, but nonetheless thriving. This borrowing and replication of the governance functions embedded in a country's colonial past is one way that I suggested in my paper for recolonizing failing parts of the Third World. The other was for Western governments to formally share some sovereign functions like public finance and law and order, a model that has been successfully attempted in various African countries in recent years. There's a third way I suggested in the paper that the colonial inheritance could be brought back to good effect. What do you think would happen if the British were invited back to rule a small parcel of land in Nigeria, somewhere where no one lived, just as Lagos, Singapore, Accra, Hong Kong, and Aden were sparsely populated places until British colonialism turned them into humane, decent, and opportunity-filled places? This is the idea of the charter city, suggested by Paul Romer back in 2009, in which a host nation would consent to hand over sovereignty for some fixed period, say 99 years, in order to stimulate development and diffusion of good governance. Over that period, people from the host nation who wanted to migrate to the charter city could do so at the discretion of its authorities. Charter cities would be risky. Sir Paul Collier, the great development economist, told our gathering at Oxford in May that the problem with charter cities is that if they do not work, local politicians will be blamed, and if they do work, local politicians will be blamed. This all stems from a fundamental problem. Anti-colonialism has become so entrenched, not just in the Western Academy, but in the politics of many failed states, that nothing short of an enlightenment that ushers in a productive encounter with the modern world will do. Charter cities are the developmental equivalent of a moonshot. Still, sometimes you reach the moon. Let me close my remarks with a reminder that this issue is coming soon to a public policy issue near you. A few weeks ago, I received from Rhode Island's principal archaeologist, Timothy Ives, an advance copy of his forthcoming paper in the journal Northeast Anthropology. It discusses the growing problem of anti-colonial agitation among contemporary Native American activists. This is closely linked to the decolonizing movement elsewhere. The specific question at stake in his paper is whether mysterious piles of stones, often found throughout New England, were left behind by early European farmers to prevent soil erosion, demarcate boundaries, or simply store the debris from cleared fields, or by earlier native groups as ceremonial stone landscapes with spiritual meaning. Being a trained and professional archaeologist, Dr. Ives published a paper arguing that most of the piles are from European settlers. Guess what happened next? Of course you know. He was quickly labeled a racist with an unreformed colonial mentality whose research represented violence and oppression against Native groups and who should lose his job, if not worse. Native American radicals intent on quote-unquote decolonizing research with so-called insurgent methodologies, as in this case, are doing their people no favors. For such approaches are an abandonment of the shared justification based on logic and evidence that makes knowledge possible. They reduce Native American knowledge claims to nothing more than rent-seeking and political activism. That is, they make them easy to ignore, thus marginalizing those groups. The piles of stones, I'm sure they will sort themselves out. I'm more worried about the children of Native American communities and the children of anti-colonial third world countries being brought up in a toxic social atmosphere in which they are taught from a young age that science is nonsense, that they are eternal victims of colonial society, that they bear spiritual wisdom no matter what choices they make in their lives, and that they serve their people by rebelling against the modern world. That's what I call violence and oppression. And that, in a nutshell, is the case for colonialism. Thank you.
Hello all. My name is Paul Bjerk. I teach African and world history here at Texas Tech with a focus on 20th century Africa. And you know, there's a lot to say here, and it's hard to know where to start. You know, one of the problems with what we've heard is its misconception of the academia at large and what we do and how we do it. There are excesses in our culture that are that happen widely, and I think it is regrettable right now the kind of heightened animosity we see over the question of what is truth. But I don't think Dr. Gilley's current essay helps us get past that. In fact, it seems largely structured to create spectacle, to create controversy, to create this kind of anger. I teach world and African history, and I take a fairly tragic view of history. As a result, history is a history of conquest. It's a history of violence. It's a history of differential technological and kind of cultural states in different places, in different times, and it continues. We haven't seen the end of colonialism, but I think it's a fairly fantastical premise to even imagine a reinstatement of a Western, quote-unquote, colonialism. Okay, so he presents us with the invitation to outrage, and it debases serious thought and undermines productive discussion. So my role here is to try to provide you, the audience, with a little bit of perspective. I think had Dr. Berman been invited, that's a typo on my list. Had Dr. Gilley been invited here to talk about his work on China, which he's written several books about contemporary Chinese politics, I'm sure that would have been fascinating and highly productive of useful discussion. Here, he's on to a new tack, and I'm not quite sure why, in terms of this particular defense of colonialism, and a couple other articles which are related. And had we been talking about China, I might have been here in the audience, but not on this stage. I'm here because there's a fraudulent aspect to this entire event, and I'll have to explain. Dr. Gilley made note of the fact that his paper was accepted, apparently by the Third World Quarterly. It was then withdrawn because of the dispute which was referenced here. If there was a death threat, I think that's to be condemned. And it's as silly as the entire kind of tempest in a teapot that his article was. I don't know the details of it, but the essay itself is not of a quality that would normally be accepted in a peer-reviewed journal. How it got accepted and why, I don't know. But this kind of thing happens. And I think what came out was it stood as something that the journal did not want to have in its, as a published part of its record, because it wasn't of the standard that you normally find in a peer-reviewed journal. I've been a reviewer for articles. My articles have been reviewed. They've been rejected. They've been revised. They've gone. That's something that happens through the process of peer review. And there is an arbitrary aspect to it. You never know why a reviewer, maybe he didn't read it, maybe he wanted, we got around to reading it, maybe he didn't like it. There's a lot of reasons why an article may be rejected that are not always purely on the merits of the article, and there's a lot of reasons why an article may be accepted that are not always on the merits of the article. But the process as a whole is a useful one, in the sense that an article gets rejected, normally you get back comments, and you can then revise the article and submit it to that journal or another journal, after revision. And I've kind of openly abused that process to improve my articles. And many of them have gone through several iterations as a result of rejection. Okay, so that's the kind of thing that happens. Now, Dr. Gilley's essay that appeared, much like his talk, was a series of sort of informal riffs that make a show of throwing around some quotes and some citations, many of which are out of context, many of which are misconstrued, and people who have reviewed his article could specify that more clearly. But there's no evidence that he's really read and digested the vast literature in history and political science on colonialism in Africa and elsewhere. And so the first question for a peer-reviewed article of this sort: does the author demonstrate a knowledgeable understanding of the current state of research? And then, is the author guided by a serious consideration of the current state of knowledge? And the answer to both of these questions would be no. So, I think his article might have benefited by a rejection and by the process of peer review, of comment, of revision, and maybe over time, as he moves into this new area of thought, he could broaden his reading, try to digest this vast literature and the debates that are going on. The mere premise that is colonialism good or bad, it's a silly premise. And it's not really in happening in the debate about what the effect of colonialism was on African and other societies. It's a complex effect. It was transformative in many ways, as other colonialisms were in other times and periods in the world. It was violent in ways that he elided. Did it bring a Western style of education? Yes, it did. And we can see lots of aspects of that. I first went to Africa as a missionary, as a volunteer with the Lutheran Church, and I taught at a university being started out of a partnership with the Lutheran Church there in Tanzania. So I'm fully aware of the complexity of these effects and of the value of many aspects of what we define as Western civilization, but also the value of much of what we see in African culture, and the interaction of these is very complex. Okay, it's also not unusual for published essays and books to be critiqued or withdrawn, although the withdrawal usually happens before publication. Dr. Gilley's essay makes a quick and misconstrued reference to Carolyn Elkin's book on the Mau Mau called Imperial Reckoning. Now, Carolyn Elkin, this book is the type of thing that he would aim to draw as this kind of extremist anti-colonial rhetoric, where she's drawing this picture of British atrocity in Kenya as a result of this insurgency coming from Mau Mau. And indeed, Elkin's work got a lot of press. She herself was a good self-promoter. She was working with some people in Kenya who wanted to bring a claim for reparations for the damages caused by British colonialism, and for that reason she had a kind of ideological bent to her work. So, in the popular press, in the popular mindset, we do see something of the pattern that he's illustrating, but not in the scholarship. Carolyn Elkin's book was torn, well, I would say torn apart. It was a withering critique by Bruce Berman, a professor of Kenyan history himself. And he acknowledged that the basic research, the archival research, the details she brought to British re-education camps and the way they ran them in Kenya, and the brutality of what happened in regards to them, that detail was useful. But the book suffered from an analytical weakness and that misunderstood the complexity of the colonial encounter. And as a result of that, her book is not very much used in the academy today, except maybe for reference for that good archival research that she did, which was solid. And if you look at her record, she's published very little since then, even though she's still a professor at Harvard. So that's kind of a sad case. But leftists get rejected by the academy as well. Let's see. So the actual content of Dr. Gilley's essay on the case for colonialism is a bit silly. I can't even deal with the myriad distortions and misunderstandings, simplifications that were in his talk today, or that were in the article. It would be an overwhelming task. I mean, both at a philosophical level in the way he's conceptualizing what is colonialism and the relationship of colonialism to world history, but also at the level of detail in terms of what's happening. The story about the Fulani and the Sokoto Caliphate and so forth, what was elided, what was avoided in his discourse was that the British, in the process of conquest, used a tried and true method of governance, which is to use local authorities on behalf, and pay them off and kind of buy the local authorities off, as was done by the Romans in ancient Palestine, where King Herod was very much a loyalist to the imperial Romans, much to the frustration of many of the people of ancient Israel. Okay, but they did the same thing. So the Sokoto rulers, the Fulani rulers, remained in charge after colonialism, and their power was only enhanced by the fact that it had the backing of British armies to be used. So, slavery continued well into colonial times. Colonial powers used forced labor, so slavery became a kind of part-time thing. It wasn't a full-time thing. But there was a loss of status in the sense that Sokoto Caliphate, it was an old-fashioned slavery. It was an Islamic slavery that was more like ancient Roman slavery or something in a very different time, when the slave could also be a very powerful officer in the government. It's a complex idea, we can't go into it now. But there's more complexity to what he drew in that kind of fake conversation that he drew between Mr. Wilson in Boston and Baba. Okay, so we can't, there are some very good critiques online that you can find. My colleague at the University of Wisconsin, Brandon Kendhammer, wrote an insightful critique of the article. He himself has written a very insightful book about the rise of Islamic extremism in Nigeria, based on his primary research in country on that. Another is by Sahar Khan, who is a postdoctoral fellow at the Cato Institute, which is a conservative think tank, and she wrote an excellent kind of dissection of some of the sources he used and how he misused them. Okay. Colonialism broadly is a conquest and a subsequent attempt to control the people of a territory. The historical or philosophical question is about why a country conquers another and seeks to build an empire is beyond the scope of my comments here. But suffice to say that imperialism and colonial rule are ancient and more or less continuous in world history. This is an inevitably violent process, but there are more sophisticated means of control through the methods of a police state, through the use of ostensibly traditional authorities in the region that you can co-opt, through the use of financial instruments. And so you can control a region using those instruments. Now, whether you have benefited that region in doing so, again, is a complicated question. And European colonialism itself died out by the late 20th century for reasons that are not really addressed in Dr. Gilley's article, and we can't go into here. But to imagine that the current nation-state system, which itself is an imposition of an order, it is the legacy in some ways of this Western civilization of which we talk, the nation-state system and the idea of sovereignty that we have. That's a rule-based system. We put that in place for a reason. It works in a certain way. Now, can we question that? Can we imagine another system for global governments? Certainly. But that's the system we're using now. And the reason, I guess, some maybe react against colonialism is because it's an affront to the global order that we now use. Now, if you want to get into a real debate about the nature of the global order, again, that's beyond the essay that Dr. Gilley presented. Okay. And something far less far-fetched already exists, and it's something that the first president of Ghana more famously called neocolonialism. So here we have a thing where we exercise power in the global world in various ways through these financial and other kinds of instruments. And in effect, it has some of the benefits of colonialism, both for, I guess, the people being neo-colonized and for us. And it has many of the problems that go along with it. And it's a complex thing, and the world is a complex place, and it's a tragic place. The world is a tragic place. So we have neocolonialism. And the great powers today, namely US and China, exercise a great deal of neocolonialism across the world. Suffice to say, Dr. Gilley's essay does not consider this. So if we take his essay seriously, you have to consider its full implications. And we have to wonder, well, the US today is politically dysfunctional. The US today has this huge national debt, which is reflective of some of that political dysfunction. The US today has crevices in the society that threaten to tear us apart. So far so good. The institutions remain strong. There is a lot of resilience in American society, and I believe very strongly in that. But let's just imagine China's continued rise, and Dr. Gilley would know much about this. Let's just imagine the continued expansion of its capabilities and its building of infrastructure across the world. Let's just keep in mind the kind of leverage China does retain over the US economy because of its economic connections and because of its holdings of US treasury bonds. If China were to decide to exercise control over US policy for the good of Americans who are suffering under a dysfunctional government, would his argument still hold? Are we going to then say, yeah, the case for colonialism remains? And if we imagine that, we realize how complex this case is. That the idea of who I am, of identity, is a profound thing. And people will live a materially much more humble life in order to retain their sense of self and their sense of culture and their sense of identity. Okay, so if we state the problem in those terms, the premise of his article is indeed ridiculous. So, why does a respected scholar of China move to this kind of outrageous, attention-grabbing essay? And I would say the essay's real target is not an analysis of colonialism or the world order, but his desire to offend the sensibilities of contemporary society. And that came up a lot in his argument, where he's describing contemporary society in certain ways. And he hopes that with a little provocative punch, he can change the dynamic that's at work. So, that's far too broad a topic to take on here, but what bugs me is something else about this essay. So he provides this essay. This premise is a bit silly. And towards the end, he says, so, let me just reiterate my modest idea that the West can impose a new colonialism from scratch. So he uses this phrase, the modest idea. Now, it's a direct reference to the famous essay by Jonathan Swift, A Modest Proposal. And Modest Proposal was, it's used as a model of satire, right? Well, you might have read it in high school. He goes, firstly, he's talking about the problem of the poor Irish. He says, firstly, there's this, secondly, thirdly, fourthly, 12thly, 13thly. He's mocking he's mocking the norms of public discourse at the time. And he says, well, the problem with, so we can easily solve the problem of the poor Irish by using their babies as food for the rich. And he says we can fricassee them, we can roast them, we can fry them. And he's being silly, and it's clearly satire. And the point he's making is that the kind of polite debates about what to do about poverty in early industrial England and Ireland are perhaps more complicated than that. So that's called satire. And it strikes me that he's pulled a little bit of a bait and switch here. He's written an article that is satire. And it satirizes this kind of extreme anti-colonial rhetoric that does exist, I suppose. It's a thing, but it's I think good scholarship usually guards us against it in that regard. But it satirizes that, and it satirizes sort of some image of the academy that he's seeking to portray. But if satire, then he turns and asks us to take it seriously. Then he turns and asks us to take it as a peer-reviewed piece of research. And at that level, it doesn't work. At that level, it's not of that quality. And that kind of bait and switch, I find to be dishonest. It's rhetorically dishonest. It takes its audience for granted. And there's and when I look more closely as I prepared for this, I began to realize there's something else a bit dishonest about this entire presentation. And this is why people would protest it. He was brought here by the Institute for the Study of Western Civilization, which is established here at Texas Tech, run by Dr. Steve Balch, and funded through resources that he was able to bring with him for that institute. The outfit that did republish Dr. Gilley's article is called the National Association for Scholars, of Scholars, pardon me. And Steve Balch would know well, because he founded this organization in 1987. It fell on hard times, apparently, but now it's up and running. It has a budget of over $1 million and has a wide range of donors, most of which are conservative foundations, like the Charles Koch Foundation and others. And its goal seems to be to highlight this sort of the drama of outrage of which we have too much of in this country today, and to illustrate that therefore scholarship is biased and unfair. It also seeks to defend those who question the science around climate change, and it strikes me a bit hypocritical for Dr. Gilley then to say, well, after all, the good thing about colonialism is a broader knowledge of science to people, and now if they don't have that, that's a sad thing. And here we are denying well-established science through the National Association of Scholars. Now, it so happens that Dr. Gilley, in 2016, established a branch of the National Association of Scholars in Oregon, and he's the president and treasurer of that branch. And so then his essay is withdrawn from the Third World Quarterly, and the president of the National Association of Scholars trumpets this withdrawal as an example of the kind of outrage that we should share. And through this process, then Steve Balch, when the Institute of Western Civilization invites him to come down here. So this is not merely a presentation by a well-established scholar of colonial history. It's not that at all. It's an ideologically formed event that was brought here to create some sort of a drama in which we are participating. And I find that as fraudulent as the logical structure of the essay with its bait and switch between satire and seriousness. And that's the problem with this event. So I'll leave my comments at that. Thank you.
Well, I could not have given you a better illustration of what I have faced over the last year than what you just heard. A series of ad hominem attacks on me as a person, on my integrity as an individual and as a scholar, claim that I'm part of some dark right-wing conspiracy, Hillary voter, middle, moderate Canadian, yes, I'm part of some right-wing conspiracy, and a view that I had things going on in my mind that apparently even I was not aware of. My intention was to create a spectacle. My intention was to offend. I wanted English professors and yoga instructors to write petitions demanding I be punished. That's news to me, and it's fascinating, and I would love to learn more about what I was intending to do from such scholars. The real truth is, I started to write a biography of a former British colonial official whose name is Sir Allan Burns. And Sir Allan Burns was governor of the Gold Coast, Ghana, well-loved governor of the Gold Coast, called my father by Kwame Nkrumah. And for 10 years after that, from 48 to 57, was the chief British representative at the United Nations Trusteeship Council, which dealt with trusteeship territories, but more broadly colonial issues, and was probably the most articulate and one of the last great defenders of the colonial enterprise. And as I started to work on his biography and working with his family and his letters and stuff, and I'm trying to essentially to boil down his arguments about colonialism and to create a kind of schematic essay that would frame the writing of the book, I put pen to paper and wrote that essay, The Case for Colonialism, as an attempt to distill his thinking and my thinking so that as I write the book, I have some framework in mind. But apparently that wasn't my intention, I've just learned. Intentionally, I was intending a spectacle. And apparently, I'm so good at it that not only I can create the spectacle, but I can cause academics to join petitions, as our faculty member here did, one of the 23 calling for this talk to be canceled. So I'm a genius, apparently, in terms of creating these spectacles. Is it a silly premise? Colonialism good or bad? Yes, it is. It is. Colonialism is complicated. We probably should never reduce any major historical phenomenon such as this to good bad. I wonder then why the office of the president of Texas Tech a few hours ago issued a statement declaring that colonialism was bad. I mean, if that's the case, that we shouldn't engage in good-bad discussions, then certainly it has to start with the office of the presidency. I have stated in many places that my ideal is for the issue of colonialism to become simply another topic on which we can conduct research and have findings of various sorts. And we can, when we find aspects of colonialism that were beneficial, publish on them and write on them and be clear about that. We've lost that ability. So in some sense, I was intentionally decomplexifying and simplifying the research on colonialism in that article, if only to point out, hey, by the way, there's a large body of research suggesting a positive influence. And perhaps in simplifying and trying to put that position, I put it too strongly, without the necessary complexity.
I would agree with that. And it's a pity that someone has to do that. The Fulani conquest was via the Fulani. Yes, it certainly was. But this was a very different Fulani after they were put under the control of the British. I don't agree that empires always took place through control and coercion. I think legitimacy is massively important. The numbers of British and French and Dutch and Portuguese colonial officials in these countries, even the Germans, until they lost their colonies, was vanishingly small, vanishingly small. It'd be so easy to overthrow these colonies if there was a determined opposition. And there usually wasn't, because mostly life was getting better under colonial rule. And I do agree that talking about the charter city is somewhat unlikely. Apparently this was a satire that I made up, although it was actually proposed by Paul Romer, economist at the University of Chicago, and then later chief economist at the World Bank more than 10 years ago. So apparently he was satiring too. And he doesn't know it, but I'll let him know that he was engaging in a satire. And the government of Honduras, which investigated and started to create a charter city, which they're still trying to work out. Apparently they're doing it for satirical purposes as well. So this is great. Actually, the charter city is a serious idea. And it is essentially an attempt to replicate what Hong Kong was. Hong Kong was a charter city. It was an island, but that was expanded because of its massive success, because of the millions of Chinese whose lives were saved by colonial Hong Kong after fleeing the horrors of anti-colonial China. And as they needed more land, they basically took a lease out from the Qing dynasty in the late 19th century, and hence 1997 was when the lease expired. That's why it reverted to China, albeit with many protections. So I find it unfortunate to hear that even after all of the debate that has taken place on this question, that we still cannot really accept just an honest scholarly debate on this issue and are reduced to claiming dark intentions from one another. You want to reply to that?
Yeah, I mean, I won't repeat all my comments. Other than, yeah, I'm not sure how I would, I mean, I won't repeat all my comments on that. I would say that the satire was not charter cities. I don't know much about that, and I don't know their realism, but I presume that there is, I know that there's a variety of people thinking about the idea of creating some small utopias as models that could be then replicated more widely. I guess that's not necessarily an unreasonable idea. The satire was in the essay itself, and his own reference to the great model of a satirical essay. And I think that's part of, again, the rhetorical dishonesty of the essay. As for spectacle, I think that's more built into the creation of this type of event. I don't know the reason for his, like I said in my talk, I don't know the reason why he pursued this particular line of thought. I mean, I guess it derives from the biographical project he was working on. But again, the kind of the simplifications and the approach to the problem of reconsidering, in particular, British colonialism in Africa, just would require a bit more patience and a bit more respect for the scholarship, and that's why it can and should be an intimidating prospect to take on a new book-length project.
Thank you. Okay, now perhaps the most interesting part of the evening will be to throw the floor open to questions. Speak up from the floor. Question? Well, my wife.
Yes, I will also say I am a student here. Having received my degree many years ago, the most valuable course that I ever took was something called normative discourse, which is the study of how one makes judgments. And one of the most important distinctions one makes is the difference between a value judgment and a factual judgment. The comments with regard to peer review that were made are so clearly factually absurd that they are to be, I believe, entirely disregarded. We have a speaker here who has been published by not one, two, but three of the most leading university presses in the academic world. And you are going to tell us he has never been adequately peer-reviewed? Your arguments seem to be founded upon anger at attention someone else is getting. You're making a spectacle out of yourself. You believe that you can see into the soul and the mind of our speaker. Are you a mind reader? One would wish you were.
I didn't put her up to that. Go ahead.
My comments on peer review were mostly referencing my own experience of peer review and participation in peer review. I think I tried to make clear that I would have great regard for his work on China and on the question of political legitimacy. I think he's kind of embarked on a new project in relation to this question of colonialism, and his goals would appear to be then to publish some kind of speculative essays on that question to generate debate, and that in and of itself is a legitimate thing to do. And I would just say, in regards to the particular essay that is the topic of this talk, I think it would have benefited from more peer review.
You want to say something?
I agree, and like Paul, I have, and I tell my graduate students to abuse the peer review process as much as possible. It's free and unadulterated feedback that your advisors will never give you, and it's fantastic. And it's great to get rejected. And this article was sent to another journal first. The editor asked me to strengthen it, which I did. So it was desk reviewed and desk sent back and then sent out for peer review. And like the Third World Quarterly, he came back with a split decision, 1 for and 1 against. And so he ran it up to his board, and they said, if you publish this, you will have such a storm of political backlash, the journal won't survive. And he said, I'm sorry, we can't publish it, it's too politically sensitive. The Third World Quarterly likewise had a split decision, and I would have loved more feedback from them. Their editor, to his eternal regret, didn't run it past his editorial board and was a bit too adventurous and decided on his own to make a publication decision. Again, I think he regrets it only because it caused him so much personal anguish and fear. But I think in describing this as a speculative essay to generate debate, I'm entirely comfortable with that characterization of the essay. Indeed, it was published under their viewpoint section, not as a research article. And what, if not speculative essays generating debate, should be in a viewpoint section? So it seems to be entirely consistent with that. And many people have said if you had titled it Deconstructing the Hegemonic Counter-Narrative of Subaltern Queerness, you know, in the same article, nobody would have read it and it would have been fine. But that would have defeated the purpose of generating debate, which I have done much more maybe than I intended.
You should have advised me to do that with the lecture title. Other questions?
Okay, I thought maybe we could talk about the argument. So is it Professor Bjerk?
Here.
Okay, thanks. So I'm trying to understand the nature of your objection to the argument of the paper and of the talk. So I don't think your view was that there's just no normative analysis to be done here, right? We can't even ask the question, is colonialism good or bad? It seems to me that you have a view about that it is bad. So maybe not. But so, maybe that's your answer. Or is it something like, look, the results just don't matter, right? Just in principle, no matter what comes of colonialism, it must be bad. Or is it something like, in every case, the balance, on balance, the results were bad? Or is it that we're not justified in engaging in colonialist practices because we can't be, we can't approach any degree of certainty that the results will be good, or is it something else entirely? So I'm hoping to pin down the objection.
I mean, the objection is more at the rhetorical level of the way the essay is presented, and then this question of the colonialism in and of itself. That's a vast literature, and I wouldn't expect anyone to read every single book on colonialism in Southeast Asia and Africa, let alone other parts of the world. It ain't gonna happen. It just ain't. You're not gonna read.
You can make that decision.
You're not gonna read every book. Just trust me. There's a lot out there. It's really dense. It's really good, and there's a lot out there. But the way good scholarship develops is that everything gets read, and it gets kind of digested and debated, and it kind of filters up. And if you're attentive to a literature of a topic, you'll get a good sense of what the nature of that debate is. And it is important to pay attention to various points of view. Certainly in African scholarship, I'm sensitive and pretty careful about observing the differences between the points of view and how problems are articulated between people writing in Africa, scholars writing in Africa, non-scholars, politicians writing in Africa, politicians or like diplomats and State Department people and aid workers and the way they talk about the problems at hand, and scholars here in the United States and how we tend to talk about it. And I think there is a problem of network effects in the way that ideas are generated, and there is an importance to kind of piercing those network effects, because peer review processes there is a scholarly network at work, but there's also a social network at work. In fact, I had a review of a book which wound up being withdrawn because the author, to whom I sent the critical review so that the author could have a chance to respond in print, found a way to convince the journal not to publish the review. So this kind of thing happens. And I think that was exemplary of the problem I was highlighting. Now, in this particular case, the bigger question of anti-colonialism and the place of colonialism in current rhetoric, which is where at the level at which this essay is largely functioning, as Dr. Gilley noted, and the level of current rhetoric, there's a lot of levels of things going on as the legacy of colonialism, which is destructive in many, many ways, let alone, I mean, the complex counterfactual of what would have happened were it not for colonialism, or what would have happened if colonialism had continued. Because they're counterfactuals, in the end, we can never know. Now, I forget his first name, a guy named Hawthorne, wrote a book on counterfact. He had the idea that the counterfactual is inherent to all historical thinking. And it's an interesting argument, a very philosophical argument. But colonialism then stands in opposition. It's a kind of rejected system that began to that really faced its end after World War I. It continued on for a while, and the colonialism largely referenced by Dr. Gilley is what we oftentimes call high colonialism, late colonialism, where colonialism by European countries in Africa, because colonialism in the old sense had been kind of ideologically rejected. We weren't going to have empires in the old way anymore. Because of that, they then developed this what we call developmentalists, this idea that, well, we're improving lives, and therefore that legitimizes us as colonial rulers. And the fact is, it's during that period that the acceleration towards a non-colonial or a post-colonial outcome already started. Now, so colonialism stands in kind of discursive opposition to the nation-state system and the system of sovereignty that we now use, which is a system. And we oftentimes take it for granted and go, well, you have nations and they have sovereignty, and that's the way it works. That's the way the world is. That's not the way the world is. That so happens to be the way the world is because as a result of a set of historical processes which include colonialism and the colonial creation of a thing called Nigeria. And we might argue that the Biafran civil war, the war over Biafra in Nigeria, was in some sense the last colonial war in Nigeria, in the sense that the state left by the colonial state was dysfunctional from the beginning for, again, a million historical reasons, part of which the Sokoto Caliphate did not want to be a part of the southern part of Nigeria. So the war happened. The war was in the end won by an army that had been trained largely in Britain, that had been created by the British colony, and the British supported that army diplomatically and in other ways, in part because the realization that, well, the oil resources in Nigeria are in Biafra. If Biafra becomes independent, it's uncertain what will happen to that, and that if we have our best shot at maintaining the federal government of Nigeria, and that's been dysfunctional for a long time for a million reasons. So we nonetheless have this thing called Nigeria, and this is what Chinua Achebe is reflecting on. What is that thing called Nigeria? And he's also being a bit ironic with the idea there once was a country. There never really was a country. There wasn't. There was a colony, and that now is finding its way into being a nation as an arbitrary result of a historical process that created this thing called Nigeria, which had never existed before. But by that token, much of the way we split up Europe is a legacy of Roman imperialism in Europe and the way the Romans created provinces across Europe. 1,000 years of post-colonial dysfunction from the collapse of the Roman Empire to somewhere in the Renaissance or Enlightenment, and then you have the emergence of modern Europe as we know it. But we shouldn't forget that Europe was a bunch of small little polities at war with, small illiterate little polities at war with each other for 1,000 years. So that happens.
You know, I just want to come back to, you mentioned two of the critical papers that have been written by Kent Hammer and Kahn, and I think this is one of the difficult issues because it seems easy to say that an argument has been widely discredited. I'm just going to throw that out. In fact, your Office of the President used that very term in their statement they issued a few hours ago. Is widely discredited essay. So let me take those two that I know very well. Kent Hammer recycles the so-called Raj drain theory, which is, by this point, so widely discredited that I wonder where he's been for 30 years. The idea that the British Raj drained India of economic resources, right, that it was a net loss for India. Dr. Thitikar Roy at the LSE has published 4 major books using all the tools of economics, showing how much India benefited from the Raj economically, and how much Britain suffered, actually, paid for it. Kahn makes the argument, the bizarre argument, that the reason slavery was abolished in Africa was because of slave revolts, rather than because of British, primarily, anti-slavery efforts. And that argument is not supported by any evidence. You may debate the motives of the British abolition of slavery and the ban on trading, and then later the ban on holding, and then finally the ban on slavery, even in the Sokoto Caliphate. But there's little doubt in the historical research that the reason slavery ended in Africa was because of European abolition efforts. I would cite the constant mentions of King Leopold's Free State as clear evidence of the evils of colonialism. It's the most common factual error. It was not a Belgian colony. It was a private colony. It was precisely the counterfactual to colonial rule. Because had the colonial powers not established their sovereignty there, it would have been some combination of freelancers, missionaries, concession seekers, warmongers, ivory poachers, gin sellers, and a terrible stew of dysfunction and Wild West that would have replaced it. That's what the Free State was. That's why the Free State was replaced by a Belgian colony in 1908. I'd also point out this funny thing we talked about at lunch, where in the political science world and in the economics world, which I call the hard social sciences, whenever we do statistical work and we're looking at long-term historical trends and trying to account for historical trends, and whether we're trying to explain levels of democracy or levels of state capacity or levels of rule of law or whatever, it's a common thing that one of the things you need to throw into your regression is a dummy variable for British colonialism. Why? Because it's always going to be positive. right? It's the one dummy variable you should have to throw in, because if you don't, all the countries that look to be well, people look at them and say, of course it is, it's a British colony, right? And so we've become so inured to that as political scientists that we don't pay attention to it anymore. Right? Of course the British dummy variable has a positive coefficient behind it, but we know that. We're not interested in that. We want to get beyond being a British colony. Right? What explains why, for example, some British colonies did better than other British colonies? Now that's an interesting question. Right? Why is Botswana better off than Swaziland? They were both protectorates in the Southern African colony. That's interesting. But then there's this amazing disconnect, because meanwhile over in the English faculty, and I guess in the history faculty, they're asserting that British colonialism, in addition to the other colonialisms, was largely an unmitigated bad. So part of this is a lack of interdisciplinarity on the campus, but whenever I hear the term widely discredited, it doesn't resound with me anymore. And I hate to say that because it's somewhat soured me on the academy, but I find that the term widely discredited from a bunch of academics who don't keep up with the literature themselves no longer is convincing.
Any other questions?
I was wondering if maybe you would, might even go to some distinctions about different types of colonialism. I know a lot of your emphasis seems to be on how the British have influenced. What about in the Americas, especially with the influence of the Spanish, is that a different type of colonialism? And I guess what I was thinking of it too, in terms of contemporary situations, having lived in Central America, growing up there as a young child, there were a lot of discussion at the time, I think it's ongoing, about what a lot of the countries there see as a colonialization of their countries by the IMF, and how today the IMF is controlling their ability to advance or to grow, or not allowing Brazil to chop down a lot of their rainforest because they have to maintain a certain amount of it, or they won't fund their other endeavors. As opposed to Japan, we go in and decimate the country with bombs and then help to rebuild it. And eventually, at least in my lifetime, they came from a point of being looked down on as not producing very well, to being one of the best electronic producers in the whole world. Anything I buy right now that's electronic often is influenced by manufacturers in Japan. So do we see colonialism really looked at from different perspectives, a British perspective as opposed to a Spanish perspective, or other countries?
Yeah, so I mean, quickly, I do make a distinction between imperialism, Spanish, Portuguese imperialism mainly, a little bit of Dutch, which peters out around the French Revolution, which is largely exploration and plunder and control. And I take my cue here from David Abernathy, who really wrote the greatest ever book on European colonialism, Global Dominance, I think it's called, The Rise and Fall of European Empires, who dates the second colonial period to the British push into Burma in 1824. Others date it to the mutiny in India in 1857. Somewhere in the mid-19th century, there's a renewed imperialism. Now, what comes with this renewed imperialism is a very different set of European states with very different sets of expectations about themselves and what they are doing in their colonies. This is the kind of great Conradian, the only thing that redeems it is an idea, the idea that we're not just there to plunder, but we're somehow making life better. And what it means to make life better changes over time, as Dr. Bjerk has pointed out. It starts with stability, shifts to development, and then accelerates towards independence and the governance and democratization. Probably accelerates too fast. I agree with you that beyond, if you want to divide that period into four parts, there's basically four in terms of people years under colonialism, right, which would be a unit of analysis. So there's the Raj, right, which is about a quarter in terms of people years. There's the rest of the British Empire, which is about another quarter. There's the French Empire, which is roughly a quarter, mostly Indochina and North Africa. And then there's all the rest, with little bits and pieces, some Dutch, some Portuguese, the Germans, who were extremely successful and highly popular colonizers until we lost them at the end of World War I. So the result of that is you can really just focus on the British Empire and you get about half of it right there. And it's also no surprise why so much of the debate on colonialism is about India, because it's about a quarter of the total by itself. Contemporary colonial states, you know, we don't notice, but the Koreans are quite busy colonizing Indochina, Southeast Asia, and Bangladesh. And we don't have our graduate students out thumping their drums, protesting it because they're Koreans, so who cares? But they have established strongly neocolonial relationships through their economic and government projects in Vietnam, Bangladesh, Burma, little enclaves of Korea, industrial cities with their own governance mechanisms and whatnot. And I think have done good things for those places, created jobs, boosted industrial capacity. And I think it's partly because Korea is a liberal democratic country. So like, you know, this is the difference. It depends, it matters who you're colonized by, because those accountability mechanisms on the home front get some purchase on the colonial front. It's why you don't want to be in the Belt and Road Initiative of China, because you're dealing with a highly illiberal state, which doesn't have accountability mechanisms, doesn't have media, doesn't have lawyers, doesn't have civil society paying attention to, reporting on what's going on with your overseas initiatives. And I think that the countries in the Belt and Road Initiative are starting to realize that.
Well, let's say so.
Yeah, I think we should go on to more questions. Yes, there are lots of different colonialisms.
Okay.
So barring the many disagreements that you had with Dr. Gilley's essence, I want to look at one that was more of a productive disagreement. And that was when you looked at his, you saw that he failed to mention the methods of the British colonizing. What was
Indirect rule.
What was it?
Maybe indirect rule in the Sokoto Caliphate.
Yeah. You said that he failed to mention that they didn't necessarily take away the enforcers, but more they paid them off and
use them. Yeah.
And he didn't mention that, but what he did say was that there's still a profound positive effect on this country. That there's a whole new way of life that after being colonized by Britain, there was a whole new way of life that was welcomed by these people. And you seem to think that
the basis for his argument on that, I would have to go review his footnotes and see what he was reading and whatever. But I think it's a crass simplification to state it in those terms. It's hard for me to state, what the entire history of that particular interaction, the construction of the modern state of Nigeria, which incorporated that old Sokoto Caliphate into a bigger thing that entailed several parts of southern Nigeria, and they didn't want to be there, really. At least there was a lot of resistance to that, what was called the amalgamation, and the Sarduna of the Sokoto Caliphate, Amadou Bello, at around the time of independence, said he didn't want independence, not because he appreciated the continuation of British colonialism so much, but because he said the amalgamation, of the mistake of 1914, referring to the amalgamation, should not be allowed to continue. And so he was essentially, and he was also the head of the party of northern Nigeria, and so he was the kingmaker of northern Nigeria, very influential, and he basically said, I have no interest in making Nigeria as a country work after independence. So what happened in between 1960 and 1860 or thereabouts, when the British began doing trade in the region, is a long story of lots of divided loyalties of people and who would want what and so forth, and memories of former conquest. The Sokoto Caliphate itself was a conquest of former Hausa kingdoms in the region, and the conquest that only happened in 1800. So there was still some memory of that kind of floating around in the culture. So, I don't know, conquest happens, and some people invite the new conquerors and some people don't, and the reasons of why they do that are complex, and to reduce this to the question of, well, is colonialism good or bad? It's a premise that obscures good debate. And that's the problem.
You're right.
Yeah, well, so Paul referenced my work on legitimacy, which is what I did in grad school, and I do think it's one of the great unresearched topics on colonialism, is to actually think carefully about how to measure the legitimacy of different colonialisms, which presumably differed not just with colony, but within each colony over time, and within each group. The problem is we don't have data. Really, I mean, we can measure it today because we have opinion surveys and tax receipts and voting records and whatnot. But how do you know that? So I think what's happened is there's been a default assumption that legitimacy involves one people subjugating another. That's normatively problematic. Therefore, we are going to assume it's also empirically problematic. And therefore, what research will entail will be looking for any evidence of so-called resistance to colonial rule. And guess what? When large countries with millions of people are ruled, you will find a lot of it, because there's resistance to all forms of government, and always will be. That doesn't tell you anything about the legitimacy of those systems. One clue, which I mentioned in my talk, is how come it took so few Europeans to establish durable control over large regions and large numbers of people? Well, maybe because they had the gunboats, ready to come in and blast the people if they rebelled at all. Maybe. Or maybe because most people thought the alternative would be much worse and found their lives getting better and found that they were getting opportunities and cooperated because of an ethical reason rather than a material reason. But it's a topic I intend to turn back to when I get my biography done, because I think it would answer one of the big kind of lacunae in research on colonialism, which is to actually research rather than assert the degree of legitimacy of these regimes.
Okay, how many questions are left? How many people out there want to ask questions? 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you guys are going to be the last questions to be answered, and we'll start with you.
My question is for Dr. Gilley. You mentioned that the education system in India, or at least large parts of the colonized world, was due to the Britishers. I don't know exactly what you mean by that, but as far as I know, most of the institutions, at least in India, pioneering research institutes for research, advanced degrees, and even the basic education system was actually established by Indians and the natives. In fact, a lot of the educated Englishmen that set up these institutes for Indians were invited by Indians and not by the Britishers. And this can also be seen in just basic records as to how much the British government spent on the education just during their entire colonial rule. So I was wondering if you could discuss a few numbers specifically as to how much the Britishers did spend, if you can.
Yeah, obviously I can't, but I don't know the budget of the lodge for education top of head. But
just to add a little bit to that, you also mentioned Dr. Shashi Tharoor, MP of the Indian Parliament.
Yes.
He did bring out statistics that the total amount spent by the British was less than the high school budget for the city of New York at the same time. So, I mean, that
purchasing power terms was probably huge in India. I mean, you're telling me that the entire high school system of New York
was more than what the Britishers spent on the whole education system in India.
Right, so that sounds like a very large amount for India, given how
It's
far,
very small amount, given that there are more people studying
right,
in India
how far
than
a
in
dollar.
Europe.
So I don't know. I mean, I'd have to look at what that translates to into purchasing power equivalent money spent per pupil.
And I mean, at that time, the exchange rate was almost the same.
It's not the exchange rate; it's the purchasing power equivalent, which is different from the exchange rate.
But if the
It's
exchange
how
rate
far.
is the same, wouldn't the purchasing power be the same?
No, because it's what a dollar buys you
in terms of a basket of goods, as opposed to what it buys you in terms of that currency, right? Which is why purchasing power is very different. But let me just say this about education. India has a fabulous civilization. I think one of the reasons why so many of the great anti-colonial intellectuals are Indians is because it was such an affront to Indian dignity to be colonized. You know, like the Chinese, they thought of themselves as the superior people. And it's no surprise, therefore, to find that under the Raj, there is a tremendous blossoming of, let's say, agency by Indians to create educational institutions. And I think that's wonderful. And I think what we have to keep in mind, and this is kind of the Basu, you read that Basu is the great student of education in colonial India, and she would basically make the argument that what the British did is they created the infrastructure, or the system in which it was possible, you know, to invite a great Indian scholar to come because A, there was an airport for them to fly into, B, there was a rule of law system so that the donations to the school wouldn't get stolen, C, because there was a board of education creating a curriculum. So all that infrastructure thing, I don't doubt that the agency was and of Indians. The infrastructure was the Raj. And finally, this is notwithstanding, by the way, the attempts of Gandhi to send the people back to village life and reject modern science. So there's a very interesting tension between the modernizers of late colonial India and the Gandhians, who thought that all this education was training a generation of kind of Anglophilic, Raj-loving neocolonialists, such as Nehru. Of course, didn't turn out to be English-loving, but was certainly a product of the Raj and its educational infrastructure.
Right, but that's because the colleges were not in India, they were in England. Like, for example, the basic Indian administrative services. If you wanted to be employed by that, you would have to go to England to study that. Wouldn't it make more economic sense to have a training institute or a college to administer millions and millions of people where they live, rather than, you know, several thousand miles away, when there was no conceivable means of transportation? I mean, even planes were not there. They literally had to take a month-long voyage to go and study in England and then come back. So I get what you're trying to do, say, with colonialism. What my point I'm trying to put forward is the education system and the railways would have anyways happened without colonialism. Because if you think about free trade economics or capitalism, India had the money to pay for it. There is no reason to say that education happened only because of colonialism. If there was money in India, there would have been people to teach it from different parts of the world. Colonialism is just an excuse, or it's just using the education system as an excuse to put forward its case. That's what I'm trying to say.
Okay, thanks. You had a question?
My question relates to, I think Dr. Bjerk had some things, that the rhetoric of this, in terms of the terminology, the case for colonialism, it is sort of flashing red light that grabs attention. And as we've seen here, response and sometimes and shoots up the adrenaline. Now, I say that and I think, well, why couldn't you just talk about it in terms of like enterprise zones and these kind of more sort of policy types of discussions, and made some of the same points that you're making. Because like you go back, you can do alternative histories. Well, what if Hitler never lived? Well, most things would be probably better, but probably some things wouldn't. And it's just, that's just the reality of the passage of time and evolution of the human species. But at the same time, I understand that if it hadn't been provocative, or what might be called the sort of drama of outrage that whether that's intended or not, the result is there, then none of us would probably be here having what is essentially, I think, a very productive discussion. And I ask all of you as academics, how do we have civic discussions without having to ramp up the adrenaline, or is that, because I've written a lot of articles that have, I think, great ideas, and they've been read by my mother. If that. She didn't read it, she said she did. And this does have people reading this and discussing it, even though I think in some ways it may be provocative and it sort of feeds right into the culture war and the whole tweeting mentality that we're into in this country, which is just, and that stuff has repercussions, right? People do get unhinged over that stuff. I mean, regardless of what our president says, his words matter. So how do we get a conversation like this without fueling the flames? And I'll ask anybody, all three of you.
I mean, I guess, I don't know how to, we can say an easy sort of feel-good answer, well, we should listen to each other more. Fair enough. But, we're also in a society that's inundated now by screens and voices and videos and tweets and all of that stuff. And so, as a result, there's an extraordinary level of, what we can metaphorically call noise. And in a real way call noise, but, there's a lot of kind of distractions to our attention. And this certainly is coarsening public discourse. So when we say listen to each other, we also have to then try to speak responsibly, because it's hard, and learn how to listen responsibly. When you have, everything from various kinds of extremists, it's kind of ramping up attention. When you have a situation in which there is a kind of currency of likes, there's a currency of tweets, there's a currency of shares, there's increasingly monetary value attached to that, and as a result, outrage sells. And and so we're in a conundrum, because we either participate in that and add to the coarsening of the discourse, or we try to withdraw from that at the risk of not being heard. I think I try to tell my students, we try to train them at least to be able to seek responsible sources of information, and an ability to discern what is a responsible statement from an irresponsible statement, broadly termed. Because obviously this can be abused, with the kind of use of Facebook to ramp up animosity by various players. And so again, coming in terms of my dispute with this particular talk and this particular paper, is that starting from the premise as such, and then simplifying that premise serves to obfuscate and to undermine responsible discussion. So that it's a complicated thing, but I think responsible listening goes with responsible speaking.
You understand? We have two more. Who are they? Okay. We'll start with the young lady.
So thank you for having the debate, because anytime that we're just sheep and follow one way of thought, we're not learning anything or changing things for the better, so I'm glad we're doing this. I think I'm assuming that the whole point of this in the end is for international relation purposes. Obviously teaching your students or whatever other influences you have, but in the end, colonialism is about the relationship between two different countries. And we're very global, as we all know. So in the end, what is the takeaway, I think, is the big question for colonialism. What was good about it? Because like this gentleman said, it's never one or the other. It's not all bad or all good. And as we relate to each other as countries, what can we take away from the modern era of colonialism that was good about it as we continue to interact with the Middle East, as we continue to interact with China, as we continue to interact with the whole world? What worked? What was good, what came out of it, and is that the way we want to continue to do it? Or can we replicate it in a healthier way, that same outcome? Probably what came out of British colonialism that seems like the focus has been on tonight compared to things like Japan's imperialistic period and others, is that the West for a while has been based out of natural law to not do harm to others. Obviously that happened, harm has happened, but if that's the basis for the government system, that's probably why so much good did come out of the colonial period in the last 200 years, because that natural law was the basis of the British government, of the American government. Our family fathers started our government that way, versus something like one African kingdom rivaling another. That natural law isn't there to do no harm to others.
So you have, that's very interesting, but do you have a question?
So I think going forward, I just would love to hear, there's been all the debate, but what's the point of all this? How are you as professionals affecting our government policies and training up your students? How is this going out and helping us as a society?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, I'll just give you a little micro example. So that Nigerian woman, who I'm now, I get LinkedIn friends with, I don't do Facebook. I don't even have a smartphone, so I'm not very good at LinkedIn either. Her research looks at the structure of the education system in colonial Nigeria in terms of how it was organized, how the curriculum was done, how the schools were funded, what sorts of streams there were in terms of student futures, and tries to build actually a sort of, when it comes to education in India was by the Indians. Of course it was, because they're the ones who were there. And education in colonial Nigeria was by the Nigerians too, because they were the ones who were there. They were the ones who were in schools teaching. And she's trying to reclaim kind of what she thinks as was an authentically and very productive period in Nigerian educational history by interviewing people who still remember before they die off. And then turn to international partners to do some experiments in different types of school systems and school curriculum and school organizations with different types of teacher training that actually tries to reclaim what was a very decentralized and localized education system. Post-colonial Nigeria created a more centralized education system, and it's created all kinds of problems. Not only your daughters might be kidnapped, but that it doesn't educate people very well. So international partners may then turn to help her to fund some of those pilot programs and to develop training for educational researchers who are going to look at that kind of thing. That seems to be a very concrete and specific way that one of the aspects of colonialism, which a Nigerian researcher and her interlocutors there feel was positive, can be mobilized and relearned and applied for the contemporary good.
I mean, I guess I was thinking as you were speaking about how to answer that question. I guess, I'm a historian, so that's a ubiquitous lens in the way I look at the world. But in the end, I would say, well, what are the effects of colonialism? How does it influence the world that we see today? And there's no doubt an enormous number of problems in the world can be traced back to the distortions that colonialism created in particular cultures. Now that, if we do the counterfactual and say, well, if there had been no colonialism, we'd have a different host of problems, and I have no doubt that we'd have other sorts of problems of all kinds. So, what we do is to say, well, that's what happened, and we try to account for the way that has created particular social orders and cultures in the world today. And at that point, we do enter into a very sophisticated line of thought, which is really, it's a tough line of thought. It's something that's really at a graduate level kind of work, where you're really trying to wrap your head around how do we construct the reality that we experience, and how do we perceive the world around us through the culture that we are born into, which is now one that is influenced in many different places by colonialism. You know, there's aspects of British colonialism. I mean, yes, British colonialism, maybe because in large part of its experience with India, brought with it into other colonial settings this enormous kind of experience with a very sophisticated government that they were then interacting with, that they could then apply some of those lessons elsewhere. And indeed, they applied them directly. A colonial administrator from India moved initially to Uganda and found there a fairly well-organized system, which Dr. Gilley has looked at. It included a parliament and a king and so forth in place. He said, well, you know, why do we have to reinvent the wheel? Basically, we've already learned in India, we can work with the local rulers, we can do it here too. And that indeed became, because of the whole he wrote the manual in some sense for British colonialism. Okay, but it creates a certain type of reality. The other thing about British colonialism, though, is that colonized British peoples of this arguably kind of successful model of colonial governance, successful in the sense that it worked and they didn't have to apply it, you know, however many people they needed around the world and so forth. It's an impressive feat, you know, of what they did in some ways. That doesn't mean I'm saying it's good or bad. The other thing is that they come into then a world that, because of the events of the 20th century, is largely constructed with an English-speaking world because of the movement of the United States into a position of power. And so that also has an effect on why British colonies see more success by some measure or whatever, because there's this other kind of hegemony, linguistic hegemony of English, and that's another effect that we would have to account for. So I would say the takeaway is let's be sophisticated about how we account for the historical legacy of colonialism, the Cold War, you know, whatever else we can, you know, whatever other historical trends we can identify.
Last question, gentlemen.
I think my question has largely already been answered.
Okay. Let me conclude by saying that I'm pretty happy the way this turned out, and one of the reasons I'm happy, in addition to having a good deal of interesting discussion, is that I assume that when almost everyone here came into the room, they had a very firm and clear opinion about colonialism. A few might have thought that it was an alright good. A great many, I'm certain, would have thought that it was a terrible evil. And I think both of our commentators have at least found some common ground in saying that it was complex. So if you've gone from one of those two initial positions and you now think it's complex, I think you're better off. And I thank you for coming, and I thank our new participants.